plastic wand was cold in my hands. I sat on the edge of the bathtub in my apartment on Olive Way in Seattle, staring at the result as if it might change if I stared long enough. 2 lines. Pink. Unmistakable. Final. I laughed, a strange, hollow sound that echoed off the tile walls. Of all the things I had been told I could never do again, getting pregnant was supposed to be the one that would never happen to me. 3 miscarriages and 2 abortions during my relationship with Sean had left my body a scarred landscape. The fertility specialist in Tacoma had been clinical in her delivery. Or uterine lining is severely compromised. Repeated procedures have caused extensive scarring. The probability of natural conception is less than 2%. I strongly recommend you do not attempt another pregnancy. It could be life-threatening. I remember signing a consent form that day, my handwriting shaky, my eyes burning. I was 26 years old and being told my body had already decided my future for me. No children. Not ever. I could make my peace with it, I told myself. I could build a life that didn't depend on the one thing I had always secretly, actually wanted, for me. That was 4 years ago. Now I was 30, sitting in a bathroom in a 2-bedroom apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, holding proof that the impossible had happened. The father of this child was Richard Ashford. Richard Ashford, Deputy Director of the Washington State Department of Community Development, married for 22 years, father of a teenage daughter, and the most powerful man I had ever known in every way that mattered. I set the test down on the counter and walked to the window. The October rain was coming down in sheets, streaking the glass and blurring the lights of downtown Seattle into watercolor smears. I could see the Space Needle in the distance, its crown lit up like a beacon. That morning, Richard had kissed my forehead on his way out, murmuring something about an emergency budget meeting, and I had smiled and told him to be careful. He had no idea. He had left that morning believing the world was exactly as it had been the day before. I pressed my palm flat against the cold glass and tried to slow my breathing. My heart was not cooperating. It was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my temple, in the tiny new cluster of cells somewhere inside me that was supposedly forming a heartbeat for the very first time. The reflection in the window looked back at me, a woman I barely recognized. Dark circles under her eyes from weeks of insomnia. Hair unwashed, pulled back in a knot that was more practical than intentional. A face that had aged 10 years in the past 3. The weight of secrets does that, I've learned. It presses down on you from the inside, rearranges the architecture of your features until you look like a photograph of yourself taken slightly out of focus. I was 24 years younger than Richard. I had done the math once, sitting in this very bathroom, and the number had stunned me into silence. 24 years. He had been working in state government for longer than I had been alive. He had a wife, Caroline, a name I had learned only because I had seen it on a text message once, and a daughter, Lily, who was 17 and attended Lakeside, one of the most exclusive private schools in Seattle. He had a house in Magnolia with a view of the Sound that I had never seen except in photographs he kept in his desk drawer. And I was a woman making $41,000 a year as a grants coordinator for a nonprofit, living in a 2-bedroom apartment that existed because Richard paid for it, carrying a child that Madison had told me I would never have. What are you going to do? I asked myself. The question had no answer. Not yet. I picked up my phone from the sink counter and opened my text messages. His name was at the top, Richard ***, along with a photo of the two of us taken 3 months earlier at a winery in Woodinville, a rare afternoon when he'd allowed himself to relax enough to smile. In the photo, I'm leaning into him, my head on his shoulder, both of us looking younger than we had any right to look. He'd commented that I looked like a different person when I smiled. You should do it more often, he'd said. Finally, I just sent him the photograph of the test. No words. No explanation. I watched the screen for 3 seconds, a small eternity, and then turned the phone face down on the counter and walked into the living room, where I sat on the couch and stared at the rain until the sky turned gray and then black. He called 47 minutes later. I let it ring 4 times before answering, my thumb hovering over the green button like it was a detonator. Mia. His voice was controlled, but I had learned to hear the frequencies beneath his control. There was something sharp in it, a blade of alarm he was trying to keep sheathed. The same tone he used in budget meetings when someone had discovered a discrepancy in the books. The same tone he used when Lily's grade slipped and Caroline called him to discuss interventions. What am I looking at? I closed my eyes. The rain was louder now, hammering the roof like it was trying to get in. You know what you're looking at. A long silence. I could hear him breathing measured, deliberate breaths that I recognized as the breathing of a man actively managing a crisis. Richard was a master of crisis management. He had been doing it his entire adult life, in one form or another. Budget crises, political crises, the crisis of a teenage daughter who had just been caught bathing in the school bathroom. Richard approached every crisis the same way: assess, contain, neutralize, move forward. This is impossible, he said finally. You were told you couldn't. I know what I was told. Mia, we need to be rational about this. The word rational hit me like a slap. I opened my eyes and looked at the water streaming down the window. I'm aware of my options, Richard. Then you know what I'm going to say. I did know. I had known since the moment I saw those 2 pink lines, before I'd even processed the shock. There had been a cold, quiet knowing in the back of my mind. He'll want you to get rid of it. He always wants you to get rid of it. He had told me as much 6 months earlier, when I had mentioned in passing that my period was late and I was terrified, and he had gripped my shoulders with both hands and said, in that same controlled voice, Mia, if that were ever to happen, we would deal with it responsibly. You know that. You know what the right thing would be, I had known. I had always known. Tell me anyway, I said. He sighed, a sound I had heard hundreds of times, usually right before he explained to me, in the most patient and reasonable tones imaginable, why the thing I wanted was impossible. Richard was a master of impossible. He had been explaining impossibility to me for nearly 2 years, each explanation dressed in better language than the last. This isn't the right time, he said. You know that. My career, your situation, the logistics alone, Mia, you're smarter than this. Think clearly. I think clearly every single day, I wanted to say. I think clearly about how I'm 24 years younger than you and I spent half my life in a secret apartment waiting for a married man to find time in his calendar. I think clearly about how your wife goes to sleep every night in the house I can never enter, and how your daughter calls you when you're with me and you go pale and crawl back to them like a penitent. I think clearly about how I have been thinking clearly for 2 years, and it hasn't changed a single thing about what I want, But I didn't say any of that. I sat in my dark living room with the rain pouring outside and I listened to Richard Ashford explain to me, in his measured and reasonable voice, why the baby inside me was a problem that needed to be solved, and when he was finished I said, I'll think about it. Mia. I said I'll think about it, Richard. I hung up. Then I turned off my phone, walked to the bedroom, pulled the duvet over my head, and did not emerge until the following morning. Chapter 2, The Girl They Never Saw. To understand where I was on that October night, the shape of the person I had become, the trajectory that had led a girl from a small town in Washington state to sit alone in a Seattle apartment contemplating whether to have a child she had been told she could never have. You have to understand what happened to me before Richard. Before Sean. Before everything. My name is Mia Cordelia Thornton, and I grew up in Kalama, Washington, a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's business before the ink on the birth certificate was dry. Kalama sits on the Columbia River about 30 miles north of Longview, a place where the lumber mills had been dying for decades and the people who stayed had stayed because they didn't know how to leave, or because they had given up believing there was anything worth leaving for. The population was just over 2,000, which meant that every family had a history, and every history was common knowledge. My mother, Ellen Thornton, worked 2 jobs after my father left us when I was 4 years old, first as a receptionist at a dental office, and then, after she remarried when I was 7, as a bookkeeper for a construction company owned by my stepfather, Carl. Carl was a quiet man with thick hands and a mustache that smelled like coffee. He was not unkind, but he was not present either. He treated me with a polite distance, the way a man might treat a neighbor's dog that wandered onto his property, civil, responsible, but ultimately not his concern. I understood this even as a child. I had learned to read rooms before I learned to read books, and the message in Carl's house was clear. I was a line item in a family budget that never quite balanced. I was an obligation my mother had brought with her into her second marriage, a cost center that Carl tolerated because he loved my mother and because making a scene about a child who wasn't his would have required more emotional energy than he possessed. My mother loved me, I know that now. But love in our house was measured in logistics, not an hour spent. Did I have clean clothes for school? Was there food in the refrigerator? Did my report card show grades that would reflect well on the adults responsible for me? These were the currencies of my childhood. When I made the honor roll, Carl would nod approvingly and say, "Good. Keep it up." When I brought home a drawing from school, my mother would glance at it briefly and set it on the kitchen counter to be dealt with later, and it would sit there for days until it got crumpled and disappeared. Carl and my mother argued about money constantly, quietly at first, behind closed doors, and then louder as the years went on and Carl's business began to falter. By the time I was 11, I had learned to be small in my own house. But I had learned that my needs were an inconvenience, that my presence was a weight that other people had to carry. I spent a lot of time at my cousin Derek's house. Derek was my mother's sister's son. He was 17 when I was 11, 6 years older, tall and angular, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way I found fascinating. He looked like the lead singer in one of those bands my mother listened to when she thought I wasn't paying attention, the kind of boy who would have been handsome if he had smiled more, but who seemed to carry a permanent weight behind his eyes that made the smiles rare and precious. His parents, my aunt and uncle, were always out. My aunt worked evenings at a hospital cafeteria, and my uncle traveled for work constantly. He was a regional sales manager for a company that made industrial cleaning supplies, and he spent 4 or 5 nights a week in hotels and rental cars across the Pacific Northwest. Derek had the run of the house, and he had a way of making me feel like the most important person in any room. He remembered my birthday. He asked about my schoolwork. He listened when I talked, really listened, in a way that made me feel seen. That is the thing about children who are neglected. They are so starved for genuine attention that when someone gives it to them, even in the wrong way, even at a price they cannot comprehend, they will pay anything to keep it. It happened the summer I turned 11. My aunt and uncle were away at a conference in San Francisco, a professional development thing for my aunt, a networking event for my uncle, and Derek was supposed to be watching me while my mother worked the night shift at the dental office, where they were short-staffed and needed her badly enough to pay her time and a half. The house was dark and warm, the windows open to let in the July breeze that carried the smell of pine and distant wildfire smoke. We were watching a movie, I don't remember which one, something with explosions and car chases that Derek clearly cared more about than I did, and then we were not watching anything at all. He was gentle at first, in the way that predators learn to be gentle. He told me it was our secret, that I was special, that this was something between us that made me different from other girls. He used words like beautiful and mature and you're so grown up, and I, starved, desperate, hungry girl that I was, believed every syllable. I believed him because the alternative is unbearable, that the one person in my life who seemed to want me had actually been wanting the wrong thing all along. That the attention I had been so desperate for had been a trap. That the hunger I had mistaken for love was actually something else entirely, something that would leave me emptier than before. The abuse continued for 4 months. It was not, but it was frequent, always in his house, always when his parents were away, always wrapped in the same language of secret keeping and specialness and the promise that this was our thing, that it made me mature, that other girls would be jealous if they knew. I did not tell anyone. I didn't have the language for it, and even if I had, who would I have told? My mother, working double shifts and barely keeping the household together? Carl, who could not make eye contact with me if I entered a room in a bathing suit? The school counselor who smelled like menthol cigarettes and gave every student the same pamphlet about stranger danger? Derek had told me that if I ever told anyone, no one would believe me, that I was just a kid and he was a teenager, that my mother would think I was lying, that my aunt and uncle would take to side because family loyalty was stronger than a child's accusations. He was right. I didn't fully understand how right he was until years later, but he was right. When I was 13, my mother found a note I had written in my journal, a raw, confused fragment about what Derek had done to me, written in the handwriting of a girl who was trying to make sense of something that had no sense. She had been cleaning my room, a rare occurrence, usually delegated to me, and had found a journal in the space beneath my mattress where I thought it was hidden. She read it. I know she read it because when she came to find me, her face was the color of paper, and her hands were shaking. She confronted Derek the following weekend, when the whole family gathered at my aunt and uncle's house for a barbecue. I was inside getting a drink when I heard raised voices from the backyard, my mother's sharp, incredulous tone, and then Derek's denial, smooth and immediate, almost rehearsed. My aunt's voice joined the fray, defending her son with the fury of a mother who could not, would not, believe that her child was capable of such a thing. My uncle said something about how my mother had always been dramatic, how she had invented drama ever since she was a girl, how this was probably just another example of her tendency to make everything about herself. The family fractured along fault lines that had always been there, and I became the secret at the center of the rest, the girl no one wanted to talk about, the accusation no one wanted to believe. My mother's sister stopped speaking to her. My aunt and uncle stopped inviting us to family events. Derek continued to attend family gatherings at other relatives' houses, where he was treated as a normal teenage boy, while I became a ghost who had been erased from the family's collective memory. My mother never spoke about it directly. Not that day on the train to Portland, when she held me in our sleeping berth and cried so hard the sheets were soaked. Not in the month after, when she placed me in a strict boarding school in Spokane, St. Catherine's Academy, a Catholic school for girls that she could barely afford, to keep me away from Derek and from the wreckage of our fractured family. Not at any point in the 20 years that followed. She knew, and she kept knowing, and she never once sat me down and told me that what had happened was not my fault. The silence was its own kind of violence, not the active violence of Derek's hands, but the passive violence of a mother who could not find the words to heal what had been broken. The summer after sophomore year, I went home to Coloma for a visit and saw Derek at the grocery store in Longview. He was 23, working at his father's company, engaged to a woman named Brenda who had red hair and no idea what the man she was marrying had done when he was 17. Derek saw me in the cereal aisle. He smiled at me the same smile he had used when he was 17 and telling me I was special. Then he looked through me like I was a stranger and walked away, and I stood there shaking so hard a store employee asked if I was okay. I was not okay. I have not been okay since I was 11 years old. But I have learned to perform okayness so convincingly that even I sometimes forget the difference. I threw myself into schoolwork with the ferocity of someone trying to outrun her own skin. I graduated valedictorian of my class at Lakeside Academy, the same Lakeside that Richard's daughter would later attend, though I could not have imagined that then. I won a full academic scholarship to the University of Washington, where I majored in communications and minored in international relations. I ran track. I was in the marching band. I was everything a daughter from a fractured family was supposed to be, a success story, a testament to resilience, a girl who turned her pain into performance. No one ever asked what the performance cost me. By the time I graduated from UW, I had been in exactly one serious relationship, a years-long on and off entanglement with a boy named Nathan Hale, who was everything Derek had been and everything Derek had not been, brilliant, privileged, devastatingly handsome, and completely, categorically unavailable. Nathan was my drug of choice, my obsession, my longest and most damaging addiction. And like all addictions, I did not recognize it as destruction until the damage was so deep it had become structural. Chapter 3, Nathan. I met Nathan in the fall of my sophomore year, in a lecture hall for Introduction to Political Theory. He sat 2 rows ahead of me and to the left, and from that vantage point I spent an entire quarter studying the architecture of his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the deliberate, unhurried way he chewed the cap of his pen when he was thinking. Nathan came from Seattle's other world. His mother was a senior partner at a prominent law firm. His father had been a state legislator, then a lobbyist. Nathan was pre-law, drove a black BMW, and wore his privilege like a second skin, so casually assumed that it never occurred to him anyone might find it remarkable. He was also the most electric person I had ever met. We started talking after class one afternoon. He asked if I wanted to split a cab to campus, and in the back of that cab he asked me about my major and my ambitions. His questions felt different, specific, curious, as though my answers mattered in ways that other people's answers did not. Over the following weeks, we fell into a rhythm. We studied together in the library, grabbed coffee between classes, went to films and discussed them for hours afterward in a diner, our conversation spiraling into territories that had nothing to do with the movies. Nathan challenged me. He made me feel like my opinions were worth having, even when they were wrong, and I loved him for it in the way you love someone who is willing to cut you open to get to the truth. I fell in love with him the way you fall in love with the ocean, completely, recklessly, with full awareness that you might drown. For 2 years, Nathan and I existed in a liminal space that was never quite defined. We were not officially dating. He had a girlfriend from his Portland days, a girl named Brittany who attended Barnard. Nathan never told me he loved me. He never suggested we were exclusive. But he let me believe, through his attention, his presence, his endless hours of conversation and company, that what we had was real, that I was not just a placeholder, not just a distraction, not just a girl to fill the empty spaces in his schedule when Brittany was too busy being extraordinary elsewhere. I told him everything. My childhood. My mother. The things that had happened to me that I had never spoken aloud to anyone, not Derek, not the detail, but the shape of it, the outline, enough for him to understand that I had been broken and had rebuilt myself into someone who mostly functioned. Nathan listened with an expression that I read, in my desperate naivety, as compassion. He held my hand in the dark. He kissed my forehead. He told me I was extraordinary, that I was one of the most remarkable people he had ever known, that I deserved someone who would see me the way he saw me. I interpreted see me to mean cherish me. I did not understand that Nathan's version of seeing me was more like examining a specimen, fascinated, clinical, ultimately unsentimental. He was interested in me the way a doctor is interested in an interesting case, thoroughly, professionally, without any real emotional investment in the outcome. When I finally gave him my body, in his apartment in the U District on a rainy night in March during our junior year, it was the culmination of everything I had been building toward for 2 years. I thought it would change things. I thought it would make him mine, truly, finally, irrevocably mine. I thought that if I could just be brave enough, vulnerable enough, if I could just offer him the most complete and unguarded version of myself, he would recognize what we could be together and choose me over everything else, over Brittany, over his family's expectations, over the future they had blueprint for him since birth. Afterward, he lay beside me and stared at the ceiling for a long time. I was waiting for him to say something. I was waiting for him to tell me it had been meaningful, that he felt what I felt, that this was the beginning of something rather than the end of a beautiful lie. Mia, he said finally, and there was something in his voice I had never heard before. A distance, an assessment. This can't happen again. I propped myself up on one elbow. My heart was doing something painful in my chest. What? What we just did, I shouldn't have let it happen. You know that. Brittany, my parents, everyone in my life, they would never understand this. He turned his head to look at me, and his eyes were clear and cool and absolutely certain. There was no regret in them. No conflict. Just the flat certainty of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at an answer. I care about you, but you and I both know we come from different worlds. I was born to go to law school, marry someone from my world, and become my father. And you're going to do incredible things. But not with me. The words landed on me like blows. I opened my mouth to argue, to protest, to offer some alternative version of reality in which we could be together. But Nathan was already sitting up, already reaching for his shirt, already moving toward the bathroom with the brisk efficiency of a man who had said what he needed to say and was ready to close the chapter. I should have walked out. I should have recognized that Nathan Hale had shown me exactly who he was, and believed him. He let me love him with the full weight of my desperate heart, and he gave me just enough in return to keep me hoping while ensuring I would never actually get it. Nathan's particular form of cruelty was his gentleness. He never yelled. He never threatened. He just maintained the boundaries of what we were, a boundary that was always elastic enough to include me when I came crawling back and always snapping back the moment I tried to push against it. The worst part was that I knew. I could see it with perfect clarity. I saw how I was letting him use me, how I was complicit in my own destruction. I hated myself for it. It ended the summer before senior year. Nathan flew to New York for a summer internship at a white shoe law firm, the same firm where his mother was a partner. While he was there, he reconnected with Brittany, who was doing her own internship at Vogue. I know this because she posted about it on Instagram. A photo of the two of them at a rooftop bar in Tebeka, Nathan's arm around her waist. By August, they were engaged. By December, they were married. I watched the wedding photos on Facebook, Nathan in a charcoal suit, Brittany in ivory lace. The wedding was in the Hamptons. I scrolled through the album until my eyes burned, then closed my laptop and felt something inside me go very quiet. I did not cry when I saw the photos. I had cried enough for Nathan Hale to last a lifetime. What I felt instead was relief, the relief of a prisoner discovering her cell door had been open the entire time. The obsession was gone. I felt hollow, emptied, but in a clean way, like a wound that has finally stopped bleeding. ## Chapter 4, Sean. I graduated from the University of Washington with honors and moved to Spokane to take a communications position at a local public affairs firm. I was 22 years old, freshly armed in academic credentials and desperately unprepared for the world. I had never lived alone. I had never made decisions that were truly my own. I had spent 4 years being defined by Nathan's orbit, and now I was spinning in empty space, with no gravity to hold me, no center to anchor me. My therapist in Spokane, a kind, soft-spoken woman named Dr. Onent who specialized in trauma and addiction, called this my foundational crisis. She said it was common among young women who had survived abusive or neglectful childhoods. They built their entire identity around the person who was hurting them, and when that person was gone, they didn't know who they were anymore. I spent 6 months in therapy talking about Nathan, about Derek, about my mother's silence and my father's absence and the 1,000 small wounds I had accumulated over 22 years of being less than everyone else's priority. Dr. Onent was patient and gentle and told me things I needed to hear, that I was not broken, that my need for love was not a weakness, that the patterns I had developed were survival mechanisms and survival mechanisms could be unlearned. I wanted to believe her. I tried to believe her. But the hunger was still there, underneath everything, the same hunger that had driven me to Derek at 11 and to Nathan at 18, the need to be wanted so badly that I would accept being used in exchange for a few hours of feeling seen. That's when I met Sean Riley. Sean was a graduate student in the counseling psychology program at Gonzaga University, 3 years younger than me, with a swimmer's build and a face that looked like it had been carved by someone who had a good template but had gotten bored halfway through, handsome in a generic way, the kind of face you see on pre-med students in campus stock photos. He was earnest in a way that felt almost theatrical. He volunteered at a youth homeless shelter on weekends. He called his mother every Sunday without fail, and he spoke about his late father with a reverence that made my own fatherlessness feel like a personal failing. His father had died in a construction accident when Sean was 8 years old, crushed by a falling beam at a job site in eastern Washington. His mother, a small, fierce woman named Kathleen, had raised him alone, turning down every offer of help because she was convinced that accepting assistance would somehow diminish her son's accomplishments. I wanted Sean to know he earned everything on his own, she told me once when I drove him home for a weekend visit to their house in Poland. That way, when people try to take things from him, he knows he deserves them. We met at a Barnes & Noble in the University District. I was reaching for a copy of The Bell Jar, and his hand closed over mine on the spine. He apologized, pulled back, smiled this self-deprecating smile. "Sorry," he said. "Plath and I have a complicated relationship." I laughed. It was such a specific thing to say that I found myself drawn to him. We bought coffee and talked for 2 hours about books and films, and at the end he asked for my number and I gave it to him because he was kind and I was so tired of being alone. He called the next day. Then the day after. Within a week, we had dinner plans. Within 2 weeks, we were exclusive. Within a month, he had asked me to move in with him, a decision I made with the same thoughtless momentum that had characterized every major choice in my life. I told him about Nathan on our 3rd month together, one night after we had slept together for the first time. We were lying in his bed, the sheets tangled around our bodies, and I was feeling a vulnerability that I mistook for intimacy. I told him about Nathan, everything. The years of waiting. The motel room. The abortions. The way I had allowed myself to be used because I was so desperate to be loved that I would accept any version of it, even a version that was slowly killing me. Sean listened to every word. His face was unreadable, studiously neutral, the way a therapist might look when processing difficult information from a client. When I finished, there was a long silence, and I remember being nervous, remembering what Dr. Onand had told me about vulnerability and rejection, about how sharing your wounds did not guarantee that the other person would know how to hold them gently. "You're incredible," Sean said finally. "The fact that you survived all that, Mia, you're the strongest person I've ever met." I wept in his arms for an hour. It was the first time I had cried about Nathan since the wedding photos, and it felt like something was being released, like a pressure valve finally opening after years of being sealed shut. Sean held me and told me I was safe now, that I didn't have to perform anymore. I believed him. That was my first mistake. 2 weeks later, I moved in with him. The transformation began gradually, the way a season changes, so slowly that you don't notice the shift until one day you look around and realize the world is entirely different. It started with small things. Sean became curious about my past, not in a tender, careful way Dr. Anand was curious, but with a hunger that felt different, more demanding. He wanted details about Nathan, about everything. So I told him. I gave him every detail I had promised myself I would never speak aloud, and with each confession, I watched something shift in Sean's eyes. The admiration curdled. The reverence calcified into something harder, something that looked, in the wrong light, like contempt. "You're the girl who was everybody's second choice," he said, and the words landed on me like surgical incisions. "You let a man use you for years. That's not love, Mia. That's pathology." I stood there, frozen, unable to argue because every word he said felt true. My father had left when I was 4. I had been molested by a cousin at 11. I had given myself to a man who had never intended to choose me. Of course I was damaged. Of course I deserved to be treated this way. "Don't look at me like that," Sean said. "I'm trying to help you. But you need to be honest with yourself about what you are." I tried to argue, but my voice came out thin. Sean nodded slowly. "You can't even stand up for yourself. You just take it. That's what Nathan did to you. That's what everyone has done to you. He was trying to lift me up." That was the story he told himself about why he screamed at me, why he questioned me, why he kept me up until 2 in the morning. He was trying to help me. He was trying to save me from myself. The cruelty accelerated over the following months. He questioned me constantly, where I had been, who I had talked to. He went through my phone while I slept. He created fake social media accounts to monitor my activity, then confronted me with information he couldn't have obtained any other way. And then one night, 3 months into our relationship, I made the mistake of telling him about the motel. We had been arguing about something, I don't remember what, and he had escalated, as he always did, from disagreement to interrogation to shouting. I was trying to explain, to justify, to make him understand, when I mentioned that certain physical intimacies triggered panic responses I couldn't always control. I thought sharing the context would help him understand, not to excuse his behavior, but to explain why I sometimes froze during sex, why certain positions made me panic, why I sometimes needed him to stop and he needed to learn to listen when I said stop. Sean went still. His eyes changed, not with the hardness I had grown accustomed to, but with something worse, a cold, calculating light, like a man who has just discovered a weakness he can exploit. "The motel," he repeated. "Tell me about the motel." I shook my head. "Sean, I don't want to. Tell me about the motel, Mia. I told him. I don't know why I thought it would be different this time. I told him about the motel, a Super 8 outside of Federal Way, and the way Nathan had been rough in a way that I had not wanted but had not known how to refuse. Sean listened. Then he stood up from the bed where we had been sitting, and he walked to the other side of the room, and he looked at me with an expression that I will never forget as long as I live. "You're a whore," he said. And then he pinned me down and did things to me that I will never be able to fully articulate. I lay there and let it happen. I told myself that if I didn't resist, it would be over sooner, that resistance would only prolong it, that this was my punishment for being the kind of woman who let men use her. The next morning, he apologized. He wept. He told me he didn't know what had come over him, that he had been so hurt by what I told him that he had lost control, that he loved me so much that the thought of Nathan touching me, any version of Nathan, in any context, made him crazy. He begged me to forgive him. He promised it would never happen again. He made me breakfast and brought it to me in bed and looked at me with such desperate, puppy dog remorse that I told myself I could believe him. I believed him for 6 more months. In that time, I had 2 abortions. Sean insisted on no protection. "I want to kill you," he would say, and I would surrender because the alternative was his rage. When I got pregnant the first time, Sean held my hand in the waiting room and told me we were doing the responsible thing, that we weren't ready. The second time, I told him I wanted to keep it. He cut me off so fast I didn't finish the sentence. "No. Absolutely not. We're not having a baby. Do you understand me, Mia? This is not a negotiation." I had the abortion 3 days later. I was alone in the clinic waiting room, surrounded by women who looked as hollow as I felt, some with partners, some without, all of them with the same blank, dissociative expression that I imagine soldiers wore when they are waiting to be deployed. Sean sat in the parking lot in the BMW he had leased with student loan, too ashamed to be seen entering a clinic that performed the procedure he had pressured me into having. I walked out of the clinic on my own legs, climbed into the passenger seat of his car, and said nothing for the entire drive home. Sean touched my hand briefly, and said, "You're going to be fine." This was the right decision. That was the worst day of my life. The day I walked out of that clinic and got into a car with the man who had made me have an abortion and who would, within a year, make me have another one. When I tried to leave him after the second abortion, he showed me photographs, dozens of images taken without my knowledge or consent, hidden on his laptop in a folder labeled Tax Documents 2018. He said if I left, they would go everywhere. My mother, my colleagues, everyone I knew. I stared at the screen, at my own body, frozen in moments I had no memory of. I felt only a vast, gray numbness, the numbness of someone who has finally stopped fighting because fighting requires energy that I no longer had. I did not leave him. Not then. Not for 4 more months. The final incident happened in a motel in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a room with a view of the lake, rented for a weekend that Sean had promised would be romantic. We had been arguing in the car on the way there, and by the time we checked in the argument had not resolved but had merely gone underground. The argument resumed in the hotel room. Sean escalated the way he always did, from words to volume to accusation to interrogation. I was sitting on the bed, and he was demanding to know the name of a male colleague who had texted me about a work deadline 2 days earlier. I told him it was nothing, just work, just a colleague, but Sean was convinced there was something more. I refused to answer. That was my crime. My refusal to provide a name that would satisfy him. Sean grabbed my arm and pulled me off the bed. He was stronger than me, swimmer's build, all that lean muscle, and he moved me across the room with a speed that left me disoriented. He tore the covers off the bed, pulled me out from under them, and shoved me toward the door. "Get out," he said. I looked down and realized I was wearing only a bath towel. The robe I had been wearing had come off in the struggle, and I was standing in the middle of the hotel room in nothing but a towel that was slipping off one shoulder. "Sean, get out." He opened the door and pushed me into the hallway. I stumbled, caught myself against the wall, and stood there in a motel corridor in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in nothing but a bath towel, while the doors of other rooms stayed firmly closed and the hallway carpet squished beneath my bare feet. The hotel housekeeper, a woman in her 50s with the weathered, patient face of someone who had seen too much and said nothing, emerged from a supply closet at the end of the hall and saw me. She took in the scene with a single glance, the towel, my face, the open door behind me. She did not ask questions. She walked to me, put her arm around my shoulders, and led me back toward her supply closet, where she wrapped me in a bigger towel, clean, warm, smelling of detergent, and sat me down on a stack of folded sheets. "Baby," she said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had seen this before, who had seen it many a time, who was not surprised and was not going to judge me for it. "What happened to you?" I could not speak. I could not tell her. I sat on that stack of sheets in that supply closet in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and I cried for the first time in months, not the performative tears Sean had learned to manipulate, but real tears, ugly and raw and unstoppable, the kind of crying that feels like your body is evacuating something poisonous. Rosa, that was her name, Rosa Gonzalez, I learned later, knelt beside me and held my hand. She was magnificent. She told me I was worth more than this, that I had rights. I did not press charges. I got in my car the next morning and drove back to Seattle, and instead of going to my own apartment, I went to my mother's house in Shoreline, where I sat on her couch and said the words I had been carrying in silence for 3 years. "Mom, I need help. I've needed help for a very long time." My mother held me and said, "I know, baby. I know. I've always known." I spent 18 months in therapy. EMDR for the trauma, cognitive behavioral therapy for the anxiety, group sessions for the shame, sitting in a circle with 5 other women who had survived things equally devastating. I rebuilt myself the way you rebuild a house after a hurricane, slowly, painfully, room by room, with constant setbacks. I went back to work. I started running again. I began, tentatively, to date, a series of coffee meetings and first dates that never led anywhere, which was fine, because what I was learning was not how to find love but how to be alone without feeling like alone was a punishment. And then, at 28, I met Richard Ashford. ## Chapter 5, Richard. I was 28 years old when I met Richard Ashford, and I was in the best shape of my life, not physically, though I had lost the soft, anxious weight that had characterized my years with Sean and replaced it with something harder, more defined, the body of a woman who ran 5 miles a day whether she wanted to or not because running was the only thing that made her feel in control. I was in the best shape of my life emotionally, 2 years out of therapy, 1 year of consistent journaling, 0 contact with Sean, a handful of close friendships that I had cultivated deliberately and carefully, and a relationship with my mother that had been rebuilt from the wreckage of my adolescence through long conversations over coffee and a kind of honesty that is painful but necessary. I was working as a grants coordinator for a nonprofit in Seattle that focused on affordable housing policy, a job that paid $41,000 a year, offered modest health insurance, and placed me in the same rooms as elected officials and senior bureaucrats who made 10 times my salary and had the parking spots to prove it. I had been promoted twice in 3 years, not because I was exceptional but because the nonprofit was small and chronically understaffed, And the people who were good at grant writing were rare enough that when you found one, you held on to them with both hands. I was good at my job. I was not passionate about it, but I was good at it, and after the chaos of my 20, competence felt like a victory. Richard was the keynote speaker at a housing policy conference at the Washington State Convention Center. He was 52 years old, ramrod straight, with silver threading through his dark hair at the temples and a voice that could fill a room without ever rising above a conversational volume. He spoke about housing inequality with the precise, data-driven passion of a man who had made policy his religion, and he commanded the attention of every person in that ballroom of 200 people, from the junior analysts in the back rows, who were taking notes because they were required to the city council members seated at the head table, who were taking notes because Richard was saying things that mattered and they were too smart to pretend otherwise. I was sitting with my colleagues from the nonprofit, taking notes and trying not to stare at him. But I was aware of him, the way you are aware of a storm front moving in across a plain, the way you are aware of a big animal in the room even when it is standing perfectly still. Something in his stillness commanded attention precisely because it suggested enormous, contained power. He was not fidgeting. He was not checking his watch. He was not glancing at his notes or rushing through slides. He was simply present, fully and completely, in a way that made the rest of us feel like we were the ones who were not quite real. After the speech, there was a reception. I was holding a plastic cup of cheap wine and making small talk with a housing developer named David Chun who had a reputation for being handsy, a reputation that was warranted, as I discovered when his hand settled on my elbow for the third time in 10 minutes and showed no signs of self-correcting when Richard appeared beside us. "David," he said to the developer, with a nod that was not unfriendly but made it unmistakably clear that David should leave. David left. Richard turned to me. "You're from the Housing Forward Coalition, aren't you? I read your coalition's position paper on transit-oriented development. The section on displacement risk was particularly well argued." I blinked. "You read our position paper?" It was a 23-page document that our coalition had published 6 months earlier, buried on our website alongside 5 other position papers of similar length and obscurity. I had written 2 sections of it and been proud of the work, but I had not expected anyone outside our immediate network to have read it, let alone a deputy director at the state level. "I read everything relevant to my portfolio," Richard said. He smiled, a small, contained smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made me feel, with sudden and disorienting clarity, that I was being seen. Not evaluated. Not assessed. Seen. "You're the grants coordinator." Mia, I confirm, and wondered if my voice was doing something embarrassing. "I'm Richard Ashford," he said, as though I might have forgotten the man who had just commanded a ballroom of 200 people with nothing but a podium and a set of talking points. "I would very much like to continue this conversation. Perhaps somewhere quieter." I knew, even then, that this was a man who collected things. Not in a hoarding sense, he was too disciplined for that, but in the way a curator collects, with discriminating taste, with patience, with a willingness to wait for the right piece to come along before making a move. I understood, on some level beneath my conscious thought, that I was being collected. That the conversation he wanted was not really a conversation but an acquisition. That the way he had appeared beside me and removed David Chun was not chivalry but strategy, identifying what he wanted then clearing obstacles. I went anyway. That is the thing about survivors of childhood sexual abuse, about women who have been conditioned by trauma to seek the attention of men as a form of oxygen. We are experts at recognizing danger, and we are equally expert at walking directly into it, because the familiar is always more tolerable than the unknown. I knew what Richard was. I knew what he was offering and what it would cost. I went anyway, because the alternative was a lifetime of coffee dates with men who didn't make me feel anything, and I had tried that, and it was too boring to bear. We went to a bar on Pioneer Square, a quiet place with low lighting and deep booths. We talked for 2 hours about housing policy and regional politics. Richard was brilliant in a way that was different from Nathan's brilliance. Where Nathan's intelligence was performative, Richard's intelligence was practical, deployed toward solving problems. He didn't argue to win, he argued to understand. He challenged my assumptions without condescension, and by the end of the evening I realized that I had not been performing for him at all. I had been thinking, genuinely thinking, in a way I had not done since college. He kissed me at the door of the bar, briefly, almost formally, a kiss that was a question more than a statement. I said yes without knowing what I was saying yes to. Within 6 months, we were meeting at a 2-bedroom apartment he kept in the name of a shell company in Seattle's Madrona neighborhood. The apartment was modest, a second-floor unit with hardwood floors and a view of the trees on the street below, but it was mine in a way that nothing in my life had ever been mine. Richard had handed me the keys with a speech about how I deserved a place of my own, somewhere safe, and I had accepted them like they were a key to a kingdom. I did not ask what it cost him to maintain that apartment. I did not ask about his wife, Caroline, a woman I had researched online and found to be a former interior designer serving on the boards of 3 nonprofit organizations. I did not ask about his daughter, Lily, a 17-year-old at Lakeside School who played lacrosse. I knew these women existed. I saw their photographs on Richard's desk, family photos, tastefully framed, and once glimpsed Caroline's name on a text message that made him go pale in the middle of a sentence. But we existed in a sealed bubble, and the rules of our bubble stipulated that the outside world was not to be acknowledged, discussed, or mourned. For 2 years, I told myself I was happy. Richard was nothing like the men I had allowed to damage me. He was controlled, intelligent, successful, and impeccably mannered. He never raised his voice. He never touched me without invitation. He sent me flowers on my birthday with handwritten cards that read like correspondence from another century. He introduced me to books I would never have found on my own, history, philosophy, poetry, the kind of reading that expanded my mind. But he was also a man of extraordinary limitations. His warmth was finite, carefully metered out in portions that kept me wanting more without ever giving me enough to feel full. His generosity had conditions embedded in every gift, obligations wrapped in silk ribbon that I did not see until I had already accepted them. And his love, if what he offered me could be called love, was the love of a collector who treasures his most prized acquisition precisely because it is hidden from everyone else. He did not want me to be happy. He wanted me to be his. There is a difference, and I spent 2 years not understanding it. Chapter 6, The Impossible. The doctor's words from Tacoma came back to me on the 3rd morning after I took the pregnancy test, as I sat at the kitchen counter eating toast and staring at the wall with the blank, unblinking stare of someone who has been told that the impossible has happened and who is still waiting for the punchline. Less than 2%. I had been sitting with that number for 3 days now, rolling it around in my mind like a stone worn smooth by water. 2%. The probability of getting pregnant without medical intervention, according to the fertility specialist I had seen in Tacoma when I was 26, who had looked at the results of my ultrasound and my blood work and my hysterosalpingogram with the clinical attachment of a woman who delivered bad news as a routine professional function. Astro's uterine lining is severely compromised. The repeated procedures have caused extensive scarring. The probability of natural conception is less than 2%. I strongly recommend you do not attempt another pregnancy. The risks to your health and to the fetus are significant. I had left that clinic in Tacoma feeling like my body had been a courtroom and the doctor had just delivered a verdict, guilty of being broken. I had walked to my car in the parking garage and sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes without starting the engine. I had thought about all the things I would never have, never carry a child, never feel movement inside me, never experience the specific miracle of watching someone you made from scratch enter the world, and I had cried until I was empty. That was 4 years ago. I was 30 now. And here I was, sitting in an apartment in Seattle, pregnant with a child that medicine had told me I would never have. I called Christine. Christine, who had been my best friend since my second year of recovery, when we were placed in the same group therapy session for adult survivors of sexual abuse at a clinic in First Hill. She was a corporate immigration attorney with a fierce intellect and a heart the size of the state she'd been born in, Seattle born and raised, third-generation Chinese American, the kind of woman who rolled her eyes at her own privilege while deploying it with surgical precision on behalf of her clients. Christine was the only person in the world who knew every version of my story, Derek, Nathan, Sean, Richard, all of it, without flinching, without judgment, without ever once treating me like a victim. She treated me like a survivor, which is a different thing entirely. She arrived at my apartment in 22 minutes, which was approximately 4 minutes longer than it should have taken given that she ran a yellow light on Belmont and possibly 2 stop signs on Capitol Hill. She burst through my door carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place on Broadway that charged too much and didn't apologize for it, and she stood in my living room and said, "Show me." I showed her. She sat down at my kitchen table, looked at the test, and said, "Okay. So what are you feeling?" I laughed again, that same hollow sound I had made in the bathroom 3 days earlier. I don't know. Terrified. Confused. Like the universe is playing some kind of sick joke on me. Is it Richard's? I gave her a look that I hoped conveyed the absurdity of the question. It was not a question that required a verbal answer. Right. Stupid question. Sorry. She took a sip of her coffee and drummed her fingers on the table, the thinking rhythm she got into when she was working through a problem. What did he say? That I should think clearly. I put quotation marks around the words. That's his favorite phrase. Think clearly, Mia, like I'm a policy brief he's trying to file into the correct folder. Christine's eyes narrowed. I had seen that expression before. It was the expression she wore in depositions, when opposing counsel had said something they thought was clever and she was about to take them apart. What exactly did he say? That this isn't the right time. That his career is at a critical juncture. That I should think about what kind of life I could provide, what kind of situation I'd be bringing a child into. The usual reasonable, rational, completely heartless arguments. And what do you want to do? The question hung in the air like smoke. I had been avoiding it since I saw the pink lines, circling around it like a plane avoiding turbulence, and now it was here, unavoidable, demanding an answer. I closed my eyes. I thought about the abortions I had already had, the procedures I had undergone in fluorescent-lit clinics, the grief I had carried afterward, the way each one had felt like losing something I hadn't known I was allowed to want. I thought about the doctor in Tacoma, her face, her words, the finality with which she had delivered my sentence. I thought about the version of myself that had existed before Sean, before Nathan, before Derek, a girl who had not yet learned that her body was a battleground, who had not yet been taught that the things she wanted were not things she was allowed to have. I want to keep it, I said, and my voice cracked on the last word. Christine, I want to keep it so badly it feels like a physical pain. But Richard. Forget Richard for a minute. I opened my eyes. Forget Richard, she repeated. If Richard didn't exist, if there were no complications, no career risks, no secret departments, no shell companies, would you want this baby? The answer came without hesitation, from somewhere deeper than thought. Yes. The word was so certain, so absolute, that it surprised me. I had spent so long being careful, so long weighing every decision against every possible consequence, so long being the woman who thought clearly and made rational choices. But this was not rational. This was not careful. This was something older and more fundamental, something that came from the 11-year-old girl who had been told she was special and who had spent 20 years trying to unlearn what special actually meant. I want this baby more than I've ever wanted anything in my entire life, I said. I didn't know I could want something this much. I didn't know I was still capable of it. Christine nodded slowly. Then we deal with Richard after. First principle, you want this child. That's the foundation. Everything else is logistics. Over the next 2 hours, Christine walked me through the legal landscape. Non-marital children had the same legal standing as children born within marriage. Richard has no legal obligation to this child unless you establish paternity, she said. If you don't put his name on the birth certificate, he has no rights and no responsibilities. He can walk away clean. And if I do put his name, then he has parental rights, and you have the right to seek child support. But Mia, if you do that, you open a door you can't close. He could seek custody. He could involve his wife. His whole carefully constructed life could come apart. I was quiet for a long time. I don't want his money, I said finally. I don't want his career destroyed. I just want his child. I just want this baby to exist. I can't have an abortion. Christine, I can't. Not again. Not when this might be the only chance I'll ever have. Christine reached across the table and took my hand. Then don't, she said. You are allowed to want this. You are allowed to fight for it. That night, I sent Richard a message, I've decided. I'm keeping the baby. I'm not asking you for anything, no marriage, no divorce, no career suicide. I'll handle everything myself, Then I turned off my phone and did not sleep. I lay in bed and tried to imagine what the next 18 years would look like, the challenges, the sacrifices, the constant negotiation between what I wanted for my child and what I could actually provide. I did not have the luxury of moral purity. I had the luxury of this child. And that, I decided, would have to be enough. Chapter 7, The Arrangement. Richard's reply came the next morning, sent at 6:47 a.m. to my phone, which I had switched back on with the trembling hands of someone who had spent the night bargaining with God. I've given it a lot of thought. I won't stand in your way. I'll provide what I can, within limits. My career is at a critical juncture. The last thing I need is a scandal that ends everything I've built. But I will take care of you and the child. I need you to trust me on this, Trust him. The man who had told me, in the early days of our affair, that he would never leave his wife, that I was the escape hatch from a life that had become a gilded cage, that his marriage was one of convenience and shared obligation rather than love. The man who had bought me an apartment and called it concern for my safety, who had paid off my loans and called it generosity, who had made me complicit in his deception and called it protection. But what was my alternative? I had no savings. My apartment was paid for by Richard. My job at the nonprofit paid barely enough to cover my car payment and my student loans. My mother was still working at 61, still putting money into a retirement account that would never be large enough. I did not have the luxury of moral purity. I had the luxury of this child. And so I accepted his terms. I accepted them the way you accept a life raft when you are drowning, not because it is beautiful, not because it is exactly what you wanted, but because it is the thing that will keep you alive. Richard's version of taking care of me materialized in the weeks that followed in concrete, transactional ways. He transferred the apartment into my name, a 2-bedroom unit in Madrona that, according to Zillow's most recent estimates, was worth approximately $480,000. I signed documents in the lawyer's office downtown, documents I did not fully understand, and Richard's attorney, a colorless woman named Patricia Wong, who looked at me with the same clinical detachment I had seen in the fertility specialist in Tacoma, assured me that everything was in order. "You'll receive the deed within 4 to 6 weeks, she said. "Do you have any questions?" I had 1,000 questions. I had no idea what I was signing, what it meant, what obligations I was accepting by accepting his guest. But I signed anyway, because the alternative was a conversation with Richard about what was fair and what was not fair, and Richard did not do fair, he did power and leverage and the careful management of competing interests. He paid off the remaining balance on my student loan, $34,000 that vanished from my life like a debt that had never existed. He quietly arranged for my younger half-brother, Tyler, a 22-year-old who had drifted through a third-tier state university on a sports scholarship he never earned and was now working a part-time job at a gym in Tacoma, unable to hold down a real job because he had never learned how to work, to be hired as a project coordinator at a construction firm in Vallview, a company that happened to be a vendor for several state contracts overseen by Richard's department. And he gave my mother, Ellen, a financial arrangement that she believed was the result of a friend who had recommended her for a position as a bookkeeper at a consulting firm in Seattle with excellent benefits and a pension plans. My mother asked no questions. She had learned, over the course of her life, that some doors opening was accompanied by other doors remaining firmly shut, and she had made peace with the arithmetic of silence. I was 30 weeks pregnant when Richard drove me to a clinic in Bellevue to see the baby on an ultrasound screen. I had resisted earlier ultrasounds, partly out of fear, and partly because I didn't want to see the child until I was certain I would be allowed to keep it. But Christine had insisted. "You need to see it," she said. "You need to know that this is real, that this is happening, that there's something in there that's actually going to come out and be a person. Otherwise it's too easy to let Richard convince you that this is just a hypothetical situation that can be managed with the right policy approach." The clinic was a boutique prenatal imaging center that catered to wealthy expectant parents who wanted a more personalized experience than a hospital could provide. The waiting room had leather chairs and soft lighting. I sat in a chair and stared at my reflection and tried to recognize the woman looking back at me, 30 years old, 5 months pregnant, carrying a secret that could destroy a powerful man's life if it became public. Richard was with me. He had taken the afternoon off, a rarity significant enough that I noticed it, and we had driven to Bellevue in his car, a black Audi A6 that he drove with the same controlled precision he brought to everything. In the waiting room, he sat beside me and read a magazine with the cover story of which senator was likely to be indicted next, and I watched his profile and tried to remember why I had ever thought this man was worth the cost of everything I was paying. The technician spread warm gel on my belly and pressed the transducer against my skin. On the monitor, I saw a shape that was unmistakably human, head, spine, limbs folded in that characteristic fetal curl. The heart was beating. It was a fast, rhythmic flutter, visible as a pulse of light on the screen, and I stared at it until my vision blurred with tears. I had seen this before, on television and in movies, but I had never understood what it would feel like, the sudden, overwhelming proof that somewhere inside you, something is alive and growing and becoming. Richard was sitting in a chair beside me, watching the monitor with an expression I could not read. There was something in his eyes, something that might have been fear, or wonder, or the particular grief of a man watching a version of himself he could never actually claim. "What are you thinking?" I asked him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I never thought I'd see this. This, not you or us or the baby, just this, the image on the screen, the proof of a future he could not control. We named the baby Grace. Not because Richard suggested it, he was absent from that decision, diplomatically and deliberately, but because my mother had once told me that the best gift anyone ever gave her was the morning I was born, and that she had looked at my tiny, red, squalling face and thought, Grace, she said the word like it was a private joke between a thread of continuity she was stitching through the fabric of our broken family. I named my daughter Grace because I wanted her to know that she had been wanted, not as a bargaining chip or a pawn in some political calculation, but as a gift. Undeserved, unearned, given freely to a woman who had every reason to believe she deserved nothing at all. Hashtag Chapter 8, The Silence After. Grace was born on a Thursday in late June at Swedish Medical Center in Seattle's First Hill neighborhood. She was 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with dark hair that stood up in a tuft at the crown of her head, and my eyes, large, dark, searching eyes that seemed to take in everything at once and file it away for later analysis. She came into the world screaming, not the soft, mewling cries I had seen in hospital commercials, but a full-throated roar of protest, as though she had been comfortable where she was and was deeply offended by the invitation to leave. The nurses laughed. "That's a set of lungs on that one," one of them said, and I laughed too, for the first time in months, a laugh that came from somewhere I had forgotten existed. Richard was not present for the birth. He had sent a text message that morning that said, "thinking of you. You're incredible. I'll see you soon, I read it while I was in active labor, which was perhaps not the ideal moment for text messages from one secret lover, and handed my phone to Christine, who read it, rolled her eyes with the magnificent exasperation that was her signature, and said, "The least he could do is show up. He can't. I know he can't. I'm just saying he could try a little harder than a text message." My mother was there. She held my hand through 16 hours of labor, fed me ice chips, and told me stories about her own birth, the things she had never told me before, the intimate details of the hours before I entered the world. She told me she had been terrified, alone, my father having already disappeared into whatever life he would go on to build without us. She told me she had looked at me and promised, in the dark of that hospital room, that she would give me everything she never had. She had not been able to keep that promise, not fully, not completely, but she had kept it in the only way she knew how, by showing up. By being there. By holding my hand through the worst pain I had ever experienced and telling me I was doing it. I was almost there. I was so strong. I was so brave. Grace was born at 7:14 p.m., and the sound she made when she took her first breath was the most extraordinary sound I had ever heard, a raw, unrehearsed cry of defiance, of arrival, of "I am here, I exist, the world will not ignore me." They placed her on my chest and I looked at her and felt something shift inside me, a tectonic plate moving, rearranging the geography of who I was. I had survived Derek. I had survived Nathan. I had survived Sean and the clinics and the silence and the years of being told I was broken and not worth saving. And now I was here, holding my daughter, and none of it, had broken the part of me that was capable of this. Richard sent flowers to the hospital room the following day. A massive arrangement of white lilies and roses that filled one corner of the room with their perfume and nearly overwhelmed my postpartum senses. There was a card attached, written in his precise, controlled handwriting, "Welcome to the world, Grace. You are a miracle." Or asterisk. 2 days after we brought Grace home, Richard sent a text message asking if he could video call. I set up my phone in the nursery and let him see her, a 6-pound, white-eyed newborn in a white onesie, sleeping in the Moses basket by the window. He watched her for a long time without speaking. Then he said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she's beautiful, Mia. Thank you. I'll send money. Monthly. For the baby. I don't. Mia. Let me do this. It's all I can give you right now. Let me give you this. He sent $2,500 that first month. Then $3,000 the next. Then varying amounts each subsequent month, sometimes $1,000, sometimes $5,000, sometimes a text message saying I'll send more next week that never materialized. He paid Grace's medical insurance through a plan that I suspected was not his own, covered the cost of a lactation consultant, and, through Christine's careful navigation of the legal system, set up a trust fund that would become accessible to Grace when she turned 18, a trust fund that Christine had meticulously documented and that could not, under any circumstances, be linked back to Richard's official financial records. The man was a labyrinth of concealment. I had to give him that. Chapter 9, The World Outside. The first year of Grace's life was the most isolating year I have ever experienced. I was on unpaid maternity leave for 3 months, after which I returned to work at the nonprofit, where my colleagues knew that I had had a baby but not that I was raising one alone in an apartment I could not afford without the covert financial support of a powerful married man. The logistics of my life were so carefully compartmentalized that I sometimes felt like I was living inside a series of locked boxes, each one containing a different version of Mia Thornton, none of them allowed to know each other. My mother visited every other weekend. She would drive up from Kalama, 2.5 hours on I-5, and spend Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning with Grace while I ran errands, caught up on sleep, and tried to remember what it felt like to be a person with a full night of rest behind her. Christine came by every Thursday with takeout from our favorite Thai place on Broadway and would sit at my kitchen table and feed Grace jars of organic peas and carrots while I ate pad see ew directly from the container and told her about the latest complication in my impossible life. Christine was the one who managed Richard's financial arrangements, the trust fund, the irregular deposits, the medical insurance that appeared each month like clockwork and disappeared into the bureaucracy of Grace's needs. She was ruthless about documentation, about keeping receipts, about creating paper trails that would protect Grace in the event that Richard decided to disappear. The worst-case scenario, she said one Thursday, while Grace was napping in the other room, is that Richard's wife finds out, or his career implodes, or both, and he cuts off support to protect himself. If that happens, we need to be ready. We need evidence that he acknowledged paternity, that he contributed financially, that he was involved in this child's life. A court is not going to order child support from a man who can claim he was never involved, but if we have documentation showing he was actively participating, we have a case. I hated thinking about it. I hated the idea of going to court, of forcing Richard to be accountable, of using legal mechanisms to extract resources from a man who had never wanted to be a father in the first place. But Christine was right. The worst-case scenario was not that Richard would abandon us. The worst-case scenario was that I would be unprepared when he did. The rest of the time, it was just me and Grace. And Richard, who texted every few days with the regularity of a man who had scheduled his own affection into his calendar. How are you feeling? Give Grace a kiss for me. I'll send money on Friday. The messages were consistent but not warm, the digital equivalent of a wave from across a parking lot, acknowledgement without investment, presence without intimacy. He visited in person exactly 4 times during Grace's first year. Each visit was an event, carefully orchestrated, predictably brief, and followed by a silence that lasted weeks. He would hold Grace for exactly 30 minutes, during which he would study her face with an intensity that frightened me, as though he were memorizing her in case he never saw her again. He would ask me practical questions. How much was she eating? Was she sleeping through the night? Had she started crawling yet? and I would answer them and feel the strange loneliness of being a single mother to a child whose father was in the room but not really present, not in any way that mattered. And then he would leave, and the apartment would feel emptier than it had before he arrived, and I would nurse Grace in the rocking chair by the window and wonder if I had made the worst mistake of my life. The worst moment came in February, when Grace was 8 months old. Richard had been increasingly distant for several weeks, texts growing shorter, money arriving less reliably, video calls canceled at the last minute with vague explanations about work emergencies. When I finally pressed him, he told me the truth, or at least a version of it. Someone in his office had been making inquiries about his personal life. There were rumors circulating in Olympia about a woman in Seattle. Nothing concrete, nothing he couldn't deflect, but the timing could not have been worse. He was up for a directorship position, the most significant promotion of his career, and he could not afford any whisper of scandal. "I need to pull back," he said. His voice was calm, but I had learned to hear the frequencies beneath his calm, the same blade of alarm I had heard the night I told him I was pregnant. "For both our sakes. For Grace's sake. Define pull back. I will be able to see her for a while. And the financial support, I'll do what I can, but I can't make any promises. If my career goes down because of this, I won't be able to help either of you." The sentence landed on me like a verdict. If my career goes down, I won't be able to help either of you, not I won't want to, not I won't care, but I won't be able, as though the limitation were structural rather than chosen. As though his hands were tied not by his own priorities but by some immutable force beyond his control, the force of his career, his reputation, his carefully constructed life. I looked at Grace, who was sitting in her high chair, reaching for a spoon with the focused determination of a person who has decided that gravity is a suggestion rather than a law. She had Richard's dark hair and my stubborn chin and an independent streak that alarmed me and delighted everyone else in equal measure. "I understand," I said. And I meant it. That was the most devastating part. I understood completely. I had always understood. I had simply allowed myself, for one brief and luminous period of hope, to believe that understanding was not the same as acceptance. Chapter 10, The Price of Everything. The support didn't stop entirely. Richard was not, as Christine had once observed, the kind of man who operated in absolutes. He continued to send money, though irregularly and in amounts that fluctuated like his mood. $800 in March, $4,000 in April, nothing in May, then a sudden $10,000 in June with a terse note saying for Grace's need. He video called on Grace's first birthday, a clumsy, 5-minute conversation during which he told her she was getting big and told me I looked tired. I looked tired because I was tired. Because being a single mother to an infant while working a job that paid $46,000 a year and maintaining a secret arrangement with a man who treated his obligations like a faucet he could turn on and off at what was exhausting in ways I had not known exhaustion could reach. Grace turned 1. Then 18 months. She began walking, then running. She said her first word, *mama*, and then no, which she deployed with devastating accuracy against anyone who attempted to restrict her autonomies. She had Richard's dark hair and my stubborn chin and an independent streak that alarmed me and delighted everyone else. She was brilliant in the way that all children are brilliant before the world teaches them to be ordinary, completely certain of her own desires, completely unafraid of expressing them. The trust fund Christine had established grew slowly, funded by Richard's irregular deposits and managed with the strict confidentiality of an attorney who took client confidentiality as seriously as she took her morning spin classes. Grace's educational fund was already larger than my entire retirement account, and I tried not to think about what that said about the world she was entering, the world of inherited advantage and lucky births, The world where children were already divided into winners and losers before they took their first step. I thought about it anyway, constantly, in the quiet hours of the night when I lay in bed beside my daughter's crib and listened to her breathe. What would I tell her? When she was 5 and asked why other children had daddies who came to school plays, what would I say? When she was 15 and discovered that her mother had been the other woman, that her father had been a powerful man with a secret family, that the apartment we lived in and the school she attended and the life she thought was normal had been purchased with money that was never truly his to give, what then? These questions had no good answers. They only had answers that were less bad than other answers, and I had been choosing between less bad answers for so long that I had forgotten what a good answer looked like. My mother could see it in me, the fatigue that had settled into my face like permanent residence, the way I flinched at unexpected sound, the nights I spent staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping. She didn't ask questions. She just appeared at my door more often, with casseroles and grocery bags and offers to watch Grace so I could take walks alone by the lake. I was talking to Dorothy Henderson, she said one Sunday, while Grace was napping in the nursery and we were sitting in my living room drinking tea. Dorothy Henderson was the neighbor across the hall, a retired schoolteacher who volunteered at Grace's daycare and who had a daughter in Boston and a grandson Grace's age who visited every summer. She was telling me about how hard it was for her daughter to get Ben into the good school in Boston. The waiting list, the lottery, Mom. She stopped. I had not meant to cut her off, but the words were already out. I know what you're going to say. My mother set her teacup down. Her face had a quality I had not seen before, not worry, not concern, but something harder, more determined. Then say it. I pressed my fingers against my eyelids. The school situation. Grace needs to be in the right district, and in Seattle, that means money, my mother finished. And connections. And a support system that I don't have those things. The words came out harder than I intended. Not the kind that Dorothy's daughter has. Not the kind that I couldn't finish. The words dissolved somewhere in my chest and left behind a pressure that felt like grief, except grief implies something has already been lost. What I was feeling was something closer to the fear of loss that had not yet occurred, the anticipatory grief of watching your child approach a world that was already tilting against her. I was silent for a moment. Then I said, Richard's going to have to. But the sentence had no ending. Richard was already pulling back. Richard was already disappearing into the convenient fog of his own self-protection. Richard was already becoming the father he had always been to Grace, present in the abstract, absent in the concrete, real in the way a photograph is real but not alive. My mother looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since the night she found my journal in Kalama and everything in our family shifted on its axis. It was the expression of a woman who had seen this moment coming for a very long time and who had been waiting, with the patience of the perpetually exhausted, for her daughter to arrive at it on her own. Whatever you need from him, my mother said quietly, you have to ask for it now. Not later. Now. Because later might be too late, and Grace shouldn't have to pay the price for whatever is happening between you and Richard. I picked up my phone. I looked at his name at the top of my contacts. I thought about the last time I had seen him in person, 3 months earlier, when he had come to the apartment and held Grace for 20 minutes and told me, in that careful, measured tone, that he was working through some things and needed space. Space, another word he used to manage me. Like rational, like think clearly, like every conversation we had ever had, which was not a conversation but a seminar in the correct interpretation of reality as Richard Ashford understood it. I set the phone down. Not tonight, I said. My mother nodded. She gathered her coat and her purse and her keys, and at the door she turned back and said, "Mia, you are the strongest person in your daughter's life. Not Richard. Not me. You. Don't forget that, even when it feels like you're failing." She left. Grace slept. I sat in the dark living room and listened to the rain, and I thought about all the things I had survived to get to this moment. The hands that had touched me when I was too young to know they should not have. The men who had taken from me because I did not know I could refuse. The abortions I had undergone in fluorescent-lit clinics while the fathers of those unborn children sat in parking lots, ashamed. I thought about Nathan Hale, who had used me for 4 years and married someone else. I thought about Sean Riley, who had photographically documented my vulnerability and threatened to destroy me with it. I thought about the distance I had traveled from that motel room in Kirtle Lane, wrapped in a bath towel and unable to speak, to this apartment in Seattle, where I was raising a daughter alone in a world that was far from perfect, but that I had chosen, actively, deliberately chosen, because the alternative had been silence, and I had finally learned, after 30 years, that my silence was not a gift I owed anyone. I picked up the phone. I texted Richard, "We need to talk about Grace's future. School is coming. I need to know what you can actually commit to, because I can't keep guessing, *" The response came 3 hours later, at 11:47 p.m., *" I'll call you tomorrow. Things are complicated at work, but I'll make it work. I promise, *" He promised. I set the phone down and looked at Grace's door, at the thin line of light beneath it from the night light she refused to sleep without. I did not believe him. But I also did not close the door. I suppose that is the most honest thing I can say about where I was, on that rainy night in Seattle, with a sleeping child down the hall and an uncertain future pressing against every window. I did not close the door. I left it open, a slipper of hope, the same slither I had been leaving open for 30 years, because closing it felt like giving up, and I was not ready to give up, not on Grace, not on myself, not on the version of my life that existed somewhere beyond the wreckage I had survived. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think, that may be the bravest thing I've ever done.